Jan and Jillian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
I'm excited to have you guys on. I think what you guys do, what you guys talk about is very pertinent in this world today. And I'm just really excited to get into the whole realm of boundaries and so much more. But before we do, can you tell us a little bit, how did you get inspired, interested, and want to become experts in the whole topic of boundaries and so forth?
Well, we kind of have a personal take on this and also a professional take. So, our personal take is that we grew up in a rural town of 900 people and we moved to a huge metropolitan city of 3 million. And that experience kind of threw us for a culture experience that
Shock,
kind
yeah.
of was shocking and opened our eyes that we needed to have stronger boundaries because we encountered individuals who weren't really aligned with our values that we grew up with. And so we needed to learn to kind of find our voice and set boundaries with these individuals. And then from a professional take, we volunteered at a crisis hotlines and we used to mediate between teens who ran away from home and between the teen and their parents in order to set healthy guidelines and boundaries when the teen was going to come back home after they would get a plane ticket and whatever. So through this crisis hotline that we volunteered at, it led us to our master's in marriage and family therapy. And then we also became certified mediators, and boundaries just kind of became our passion along that route.
Yep.
I love that. And the 3 million, I remember, is the city of Chicago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very cool. So let's talk boundaries then. So why are they so important? But even both, not just in personal, but also like in professional life.
Well, I think whenever we have boundaries, it allows us to establish mutual alignment and agreements and respect within the relationship. And so we're having these open discussions and conversations in regards to how can we maintain productivity or how can we maintain time management or teamwork. So if we don't have these discussions and conversations, then a lot of things can go unsaid. And then we start to create these scenarios or narratives in our head, and then all of a sudden that can create resentment or angry. So it's really important that we actually have these open discussions to maintain respect when it comes to productivity and performance. But we all work better together if we understand each other too.
100%. I mean, it makes it a little bit easier, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So people are hearing the word boundaries, and I mean, I kind of know what that is. Maybe some people don't. So can you kind of like break down what is boundaries, and let's just use some common examples.
Yeah, so boundaries are help us get our needs met in relationships from a shared value that you might have with somebody. For example, maybe somebody is ignoring you and you feel dismissed or you feel rejected or ignored. So that means that that emotional trigger is your cue to take care of you and set a boundary, because that's a limit for you in regards to your relationships, is that maybe you value communication. So the opposite of our emotional trigger is the value that we're going to set the boundary on with the other person and try to negotiate a solution with both people's perspectives on how they view communication.
I like that. I like the word negotiating on that because I think everything in life is all about negotiating. You guys are the experts in this, especially in the marriage side of things. And I'm always looking at marriage as like it's a negotiation all the time. Like there's never an end to it. That
Yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
I just want to see there. So then when we look at, we got that communication, we're having clearer understanding of one another and what we, would we say that then like boundaries are somewhat like a value system in some way, shape or form?
Yes. So whenever we're setting a boundary, that shows that we're elevating our value and we're setting these standards of what it is that we need in the relationship in order for it to grow and thrive and continue moving forward. And so the reason why we want to use values is because it's a universal language where emotions are often one sided and can actually elevate and create more conflict. So when we're using our value system, it's much easier to resolve differences and bridge the gap than it is if we're using emotion.
And I want to just also point out that we're not negotiating our value. What we are negotiating is different perspectives around a shared value, such as communication. Someone might like to talk all day long to their partner. Another person may be like, I'm at work. I'll talk to you when I get home. So they don't want to talk all day long. So we're negotiating that value communication and finding the common ground, but not our personal value.
I appreciate that clarity in that, because I think that's huge to share, because somebody might take it in the wrong perspective.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 100%. And so then when we look at then, let's say, how does someone, or what are some signs for someone then that may need to either maybe establish boundaries or even just strengthen?
So I think we can look at some of our physiological cues. So we might have a headache, a stomach ache. We might feel like our blood pressure rising. We just feel very intense or feel uneasy, and we're walking around on eggshells. So that's usually a sign. If something doesn't feel, comfortable or doesn't feel peaceful, that's usually a cue that we need to speak up and address whatever is creating this like disconnect or discord in the connection.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And so then when we have that headache, we have that I guess a stress response is kind of how I would kind of take it as.
Mm-hmm.
And come from the health world, the holistic world, and so forth. It's always looking at like, well, the more we have symptoms in our body, the more our body's not adapting or responding well. So then let's take it to another step in that realm, setting healthy boundaries. How does that benefit relationships? And if you can add into that mental health and just like basically, I don't know, the overall quality of life or well-being of the individual.
So yeah, boundaries help us get our needs met. So even though we're speaking from a place of value, the value is meeting our emotional need on a deeper level. And so that gives us a sense of fulfillment and emotional peace or happiness within our life when we set boundaries. Because again, boundaries, a lot of times I think the big misconception out there is people think, well, this is my needs, you have to meet them. But that's usually more of an ultimatum and a one-sided projection that's being displaced on the relationship. And more than likely, the other person isn't going to feel heard or understood in that dynamic. And so they're not going to meet your needs. So this is why we need to have a we mindset. And that helps the relationship get into better alignment so it can evolve and grow as well. So we're simultaneously meeting our needs and the relationship's needs.
It's like the universe. It's a win-win, or
Yes.
actually a win-win-win, but it's a win-win, in other words, in making that work. How then is it when you're sharing that? Let's use like an example for people, if you don't mind, where it comes to like someone's asserting their own boundaries, and we can use maybe a personal side of that, and then of an example,
Mhm.
relationships, marriage or relationships or something like that. And then if you don't mind, then we can, it'll probably be the same thing, but in a different way, but also a professional one too, if you don't mind. So that way the listeners can get kind of two different, like, okay, that's how that looks, or that's the practicality of it, in other words.
Yeah, so I think in regards to romantic relationships, you could talk if a couple really values quality time. We all know we have to spend some bit of time with our partner in order to sustain that relationship and connection. So, and if your partner is working a lot of different, hours, they're working late night or they're traveling for work, you may not get to see them that much. And if you feel like you need more quality time in order to keep that connection like steamy and hot and like just feeling aligned as two people in that relationship, I think this is where you would say, I feel undervalued, or I feel disconnected when we don't spend enough time with each other. I value quality time. How can we work time into our relationship where we have either date nights or just be able to carve out a certain day out of the week that we could really get, spend that time with each other?
And if someone were to set an ultimatum, such as a one-sided boundary, they might say, if you don't start spending more time with me, then I'm just going to find somebody else to spend time with, or this relationship's no longer going to work for me and I'm just going to leave it. So that would be more or less an ultimatum or a one-sided type of boundary.
So there has to be a level of awareness, though, right? Because you brought up the whole thing, like, I value quality time. So there has to be, some way of the person knowing, because there's some people who will say, well, I think I want this. And then of course, I'm just going to use myself as a male. And it's one of those times where someone will say like, hey, I want this. And I'm like, okay, great. Done. Easy. You told me what you want. Makes my life so much easier now. And then that happens. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, that's not what I want, because there's still turbulence there. And then they say this, and then they go this. And then it's like, okay, hold on here. I need to know what it is. I'm trying to we'll be able to respond in that certain way. So is there like tools or tips that help individuals become more from a personal romantic relationship to how to become more aware of their values in that relationship so they can be able to speak that a lot better and communicate that across?
Yeah, I think you want to be able to identify your top 5 values for your personal relationships, because these are the values you're going to operate and live by on a day to day basis. Because when one of those values feels like it's not being met or breached in some way, shape, or form, if the boundaries already been set around it, that's going to be another sign or indicator that I need to talk about this boundary. So if they're not, they set a boundary around quality time, but then they're not being held accountable, or the partners say, I just, I can't spend time this week, I'm really busy, sorry, I have to work late. Well, that's going to be their cue that they either need to reestablish that boundary or open up the conversation for quality time and think, okay, what does that look like for each of us? And we need to come up with like a new plan or a new boundary in order for us to both be fulfilled in this relationship.
Right. So the big, I guess, takeaway here is yes, we do have to self reflect and understand our value system to operate by. Because when we have integrity with our top 5 values, then that makes it easier for us to communicate what it is that we need met. It's also good to know your emotional triggers, because the more in tune we are with our emotional triggers, we don't want to react, because then we're coming from a place of unresolved trauma or childhood wounds if we're reacting in situations. So self regulation or emotional regulation is also a huge component to being able to set effective boundaries.
Yeah, it's very important in so many ways too, with when it comes to those kind of things. And I like the whole, again, you guys are bringing up the negotiating side again, where it's like we need to recommunicate things, or we need to revisit things, and try to get to a common ground to where we can go and try and work, because it's not going to be something that just one and done. Here we go, this is it, that's the end of it, solves the problems, right? Sometimes there's a little bit of some cultivating, some little bit of work in order to kind of have that get to that solution that's going to be like, okay, this is what works for us.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, the reason why we do focus on having that negotiation process is because both people need to have a voice in the discussion. Because if you tell someone this is what's going to happen, they're less likely to comply or respect it because they feel like they don't have a voice. And everybody at the end of the day loves to be heard and understood. So when each person gets to actually advocate their perspective, it allows both people to feel heard and understood in that relationship dynamic.
Yeah, and when you can be heard, I think a lot of times humans just want to be heard sometimes more than anything else. And to have that's where it takes it to another level. And when you're aligned with your values, is what I teach in my coaching stuff, is like when you're aligned with values, and all of a sudden that leads the path to more fulfillment, because now you're in integrity with yourself and what matters, and that usually plays a huge role. And that leads to my next question I love to ask then is like, what happens though? Because this happens, especially in families, I would assume. I would say I know this would happen. This was my experience, so I'll just leave it at that. But what happens when you do start to establish boundaries and you get people either react negatively to that boundary and or resist your boundaries?
Yeah, especially in families, you're right. When people start breaking generational patterns of dysfunction, it can be very hard for family dynamics or people who are dependent on that enmeshed dynamic for control or fear of other people and how they will react to what has been established for some time. And so sometimes it can be very hard for people to accept your boundaries once you start setting them. But in that moment, you also have to know that you have to stay true to yourself and know that not everybody's going to be able to understand where you're potentially coming from, but it is your job to communicate your value and help them understand why this is necessary for you.
I think too, even if people respond or react negatively, it doesn't mean that you can't try again, because sometimes it takes other people to adapt. It takes them much longer to adapt to change, where some people are very quick and can change overnight and make progress because they see how it's benefiting them in other areas. And so I think, though, a lot of times, like she said, if people have been operating a certain way, all of a sudden this feels like unsafe or chaotic or something, because even though you're trying to create something healthy, it feels uncomfortable for them.
Right. And I think sometimes those with complex personalities, especially in family dynamics, that are not willing to accept that you're breaking generational patterns that are unhealthy, sometimes we have to redefine those relationships, such as how often we're going to spend time with that person. So maybe you're used to going there for family functions and you're used to staying there for like 8 hours. Otherwise, they guilt trip you if you leave early. Well, it might be look like that you've figured out how to just stay there for an hour or two, and that's your max limit that you need personally, that you know that at that time that the dysfunction might start to arise and you need to take your personal space and either leave because you need to go to another sort of event, or maybe your partner's family that you're trying to also honor during the holidays. So again, it depends on the scenario, but you'll figure out what your limit is and how often or how much time you can spend with that person.
I love that. That was gonna be my other question on it, because that's one of the things that I had a client go through something similar, and I was just like, minimize your time. It's family. It's important to have family, but it's also you're making these huge changes in your life, and you're shifting, if you want to call it, the generational curses and whatnot. So I was like, just minimize your time and just make it more valuable, or more impactful and meaningful when you're there. More present as much as you can, and then feel when you know that the stuff's coming up, and you're like, all right, I'm out. That's it. I got things to do, or something else is coming up. Speaking of families, though, when it comes to then, let's look at, because I think this is huge for kids and parents, but teaching children the importance of boundaries from an early age. How can parents do that?
So when it comes to children, we usually have them learn one-liners that help them understand their physical space, their body, things that, but we also teach them their values too. But instead of 5 values, we say, how about you pick 3? And so maybe one is family time, maybe one is personal space or alone time, maybe another one's kindness. And so helping children start to learn that, but then they can set one-liners like, I don't want to be hugged today. How about, tomorrow? Or so you just give them I statements, but they're one-liners that really establish their limit, because it's, we got to keep it simple for them, especially if they're, 5 years old. But teaching them that, but once they learn those limits, that's also going to help them in their adult relationships, learning that sooner than later. I mean, I wish I learned this way earlier in life, so yeah.
I know how that feels. I have a 22-month-old, and it's funny because she'll be just be like, no daddy, no daddy. I'm like, okay, all right, done. I'm off. That's it. That's you whenever you say no, I'm backing away or whatever. If I want to give her a kiss or a hug, she's like, no daddy. I'm like, okay. And because I know then from there, because you guys understand this too, it's like the relationship male female. She's gonna, if I'm overbearing all the time, then she's going to think that's normal. And so I'm always like, as soon as she said, my wife one time looked at me and she was like, you like sprung back. Was there something wrong? I was like, no, she said no. And I was like, I was leaning forward with weight, and I was all of a sudden like just playing around with her. And then she said no more. And I just was like, okay. And I jumped back, and I was just like, I want her to know that so that we can make sure that, we're building that up little at a time. So, I love that. So as we're continuing on boundaries, it's one of the things what are some of the like most common then, like mistakes people make when they're creating their own?
I don't know if people are creating mistakes. I think it's just more or less they're learning to define what their value system is that they're going to operate by. So I guess the key here is to look back at our relationships, or even our current relationships we're in now, and figure out where our needs are not being met. And that becomes clarity for you. I think learning a new skill, obviously they might make a mistake, I guess, in terms of how they're delivering their message to the other person. And so that's what we want to be more cognizant of. That way we're not delivering it in an ultimatum type of fashion.
Also, too, I think it can be good to practice with safe people when you're first learning how to set boundaries. So that way they're more likely to respond positively. So then when you really have to set the boundary with that one person who's really just like pushing your buttons and just isn't letting go, like, and just won't, give you your space or whatever it may be, then once you've practiced and really learned that skill, it sort of eliminates those fears or the guilt of speaking up. And then you can actually address it with the person that you really want to after you've tried a few times.
Gotcha. And what happens because this happened to me when I first started creating boundaries in many different ways, family, friends, and just being like, this is what I need. And then even as I got older, looking at my closer relationships, like even setting more unique boundaries there to make sure I'm getting met what I need, plus then also serving what they need. And sometimes there comes, we talked about the conflict of it all, but what about the guilt? Because I know for me growing up, being raised Italian Roman Catholic, just you got the Roman Catholic side, and then you have also the Italian side. The guilt was just the thing that they hammer and embed. So it's one of the things where how does someone who sets boundaries, has that guilty thing, how can they get around that and overcome that when they're creating their own boundaries?
So, yeah, someone who might have guilt or fear of setting boundaries is often a child who was either shamed, dismissed. Their inner voice wasn't allowed to be fully developed, and their emotions were, there wasn't a freedom to express their emotions and how they feel as a child, because our personalities develop usually from infancy up to age 7. That's when we're developing our inner voice. And so if your inner voice is shattered at such a young age, that's where that guilt comes from. And so we really need to process our unresolved wounds and look at our family dynamics as to what was healthy or what was unhealthy in regards to why we're feeling guilty and what was told to us. Were we told that we're not allowed to speak up because we're going against the grain of somebody else's belief system? And more than likely, once we work on developing our inner voice, you're going to let go of that guilt and shame or fear.
So just keep pressing on until you get your voice back, in other words.
Well, there's different ways to do that. I think you could, do some positive affirmations. You could do journaling, or you can do value statements, which is what we like to do, where you're creating actions according to your values on a day-to-day basis, which is also going to help you start to really own your worth. Because when you believe in you and you trust yourself, it's much easier to speak up and use that voice as a powerful tool. And so building that trust with yourself can also by just doing one new challenge each week and trusting yourself to take that action. And the more you take action in your own personal life, the easier it is to take action with others.
Yes, you're kind of rewiring the brain.
Yeah, I can 100% agree with that, because that's what I did years and years ago to break out when this was all happening. And then I started understanding more about the brain and going, as in chiropractic school, learning the neuroscience. It was like, all right, this is what I'm going to have to do. This is just, I'm going to have to just over a period of time. And I kind of just pushed myself into it. But at the same token, the whole value thing was huge. So I'm just sharing that for the listeners, that this stuff is, it does work, and it's really solid if you are going through something like that. How can people follow you guys, see what you're up to, stay in touch, and connect with you guys?
Yeah, they can head over to janandjillian.com, or they can follow us on Instagram at Jan and Jillian, and they can check out our book, Boundary Badass, A Powerful Method for Elevating Your Value and Relationships. You can get it on Amazon.
Awesome, guys. Well, I appreciate it. For all the listeners, that will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for all that you guys do. I know this is huge in so many ways, and help people to lead more fulfilled lives. Because when we can set those boundaries, then we can, as we shared here today, what you guys shared is all about, making sure that we live towards what's more our values, and negotiating in the ways of communicating things better. I think that elevates a lot of different things, not just in personal life and relationships, but also even the professional side. So thank you guys for coming on.
Thanks for having us.